Edward Taylor, born in 1642, born in England. He was a teacher, and but he got fired or let go because he refused to pledge an oath to the Church of England. Now remember, the Church of England was Catholic, and Edward Taylor came from an extremely strict Puritan home, and he was very much a Calvinist, and they believed in the predestination and the elect, and that you had to have a conversion experience, and if you didn't have a conversion experience, you weren't allowed to have, your children could not be baptized in the church, and you could not partake of the Lord's Supper, but I'm going blank right now. But anyway, the sacrament, and so very strict. So they did not at all believe or understand or believe what was going on with the Church of England and the Catholicism. Remember too, we talked about this with Anne Bradstreet, the Puritans were being persecuted at this point. And he decided, when he was let go or fired from his teaching job because he refused to pledge an allegiance to the Catholic Church, or to the Church of England, I should say, then he decided that would be a good time for him to go to the colonies. Now he arrived at the colonies about 10 or 12 years after John Winthrop and Anne Bradstreet. So he would have been after they did. And so at that point, and he did go to Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Bay Area, same area that Anne Bradstreet, John Winthrop, and the Arabella and the other three ships, same area that they colonized, that those people colonized. So by the time he got there, it wasn't the wilderness that it was when John Winthrop and Anne Bradstreet arrived. So, they had homes and houses and a church and this sort of thing, probably maybe more than one church. So he didn't have to go through the hardships to, the extent that Anne Bradstreet and her family and the Winthrops had to go through, John Winthrop. So he arrives at the colonies in 1668. And he's accepted into Harvard. Now let me back up just a minute and go back to Anne Bradstreet and Simon and Anne's family. They were instrumental. Simon and then Anne Bradstreet's father were instrumental in the founding of Harvard, what is now Harvard University. So he is accepted. Edward Taylor is accepted. He gets letters of recommendations from people that knew him in England, and I think even some colonists and this sort of that influential colonists. So he was accepted into Harvard. At that time, Harvard was called Harvard Divinity School. And it was a school, a college for young men who wanted to go into the ministry. So as you can imagine, there were no women that went there at that time. And it was a religious church. So it was very, Calvinistic in its teachings. So he accepted there. He studied to be a minister. In 1671, so he's been at Harvard about 3 years. And I will tell you, I don't know which one is true. I've heard both. I've heard that he did graduate from Harvard Divinity School. I've also read that he did not graduate. He was about 3 years in, and they had another year or so to go, and then he did not finish school there. But either way, he was approached in 1671 by a group of men, community and church elders from a town named Westfield, Massachusetts. And Westfield was about 100 miles from where Jonathan Edwards, Edward Taylor, sorry. If I say Jonathan Edwards, I mean Edward Taylor. I don't know why I say Jonathan Edwards always. Edward Taylor. About 100 miles. They had to travel, and it was during the winter too, by the way. So they had to make this trek, which would have probably taken several weeks. And I've actually also read that they made the trip by foot. I really can't imagine that. Traveling in the winter, and in the north, you can imagine the winters that would have had, walking through that snow 100 miles. But that is what I've read. So you can take that for what it's worth. But anyway, let's just suffice it to say it was probably a pretty rough trip. But I don't know how they had heard about Edward Taylor, but some way or another, they had heard about him and they actually sought him out. And they asked him to go back with them and to be a minister in Westfield because they had a Puritan church, but no minister. And I don't know what had happened to I don't know if this was a new church or if maybe their minister had left or died. I really don't know, but they were in need of a minister. And so Edward Taylor did go with them. He made the 100-mile trek back. And when he originally went to Westfield, I gather that he had not intended on necessarily staying there. Or maybe he was just going to help them out for a year or two, but he ended up spending the rest of his life. He never left Westfield. He lived there the rest of his life. I'm not saying he never left the community for other things. I'm sure he did. But he remained the rest of his life the minister of Westfield, Massachusetts. And he lived to be in his 80s. He died in 1729. So he was the Westfield, Massachusetts minister he would probably been in late 20s at that point, probably around 50-something, 60 years. And not only was he the minister, but he was also the town doctor, the town undertaker, and of course he also wrote poetry. So you can imagine he was a pretty busy guy. But back then, many of the colonies or the towns, oftentimes they did not have a doctor. So their doctor would become, usually it was the most educated person there. I'm not going to say man, I'm just going to say it wouldn't have been a woman. The most educated man in the town. I mean, they didn't have, you didn't have to have a medical license back then to practice medicine. But you also have to understand, too, it was a new country. Well, actually, at this point, it wasn't even a country yet. It's still just a colony. They have not become the United States. And they're still under British rule. But there were not enough people that they would have necessarily all have a doctor. So they just kind of had to do, make do because people are going to get sick, women are going to have babies, this sort of thing. So he filled in several roles. And if you're going to be the doctor, you might as well be the undertaker too, I guess. I mean, you'll probably already be there. And it gets better too. Make all kinds of jokes in a few minutes about him being the undertaker. All right, so he wore several hats in Westfield. He, as a minister, would on Saturday evenings, so he was writing poetry. And by the way, he never anticipated or planned for his poetry to be published, as much like Anne Bradstreet. Now, he did have a few of his poems published. I don't know how many. It would have just been a handful, maybe 3, 4, 5. And they were not like in a collection or a book. It would have been maybe in a paper of some sort or, something like that was in the colonies in Massachusetts. It would have been something along those lines. Also, too, I might have mentioned this with Anne Bradstreet, but the Puritans did not read for enjoyment. That was considered sinful. You weren't supposed you really weren't supposed to have any enjoyment in your life. Now, you could have joy from your children, and this sort of thing, but because of their piousness, they thought that to have a good time or to do anything for enjoyment was sinful. So therefore, anyone who was writing, they're a poet or they're writing stories or whatever, they all had to have to go back in some way to religion, or go back, it'd be a story that was, somewhere another biblically based, a poem that maybe would lead someone if they read it to righteousness. But just to read something for pure enjoyment, they did not do. And they also, I don't know about, again, I'm sorry if I repeat myself. Sometimes I forget what I've mentioned to this class and what I've talked about in my 7th period class. But they also did not show much emotion. I mean, they just, whether it be happiness, sadness, they just didn't believe in showing a lot of emotion. Even if they lost a child or something, they did not have a time of mourning and, this sort of thing. They were supposed to, I'm not saying that, I'm sure in private that they would, cry or be upset or mournful, but to just outwardly show that, they were not to do that. And in fact, when Edward Taylor's poetry, when it was the few pieces that were published, or other Puritans got their hands on it and saw some of his poetry, they were very upset, a lot of them, because they felt he showed too much emotion. So I'll let you be the judge of that when you read some of it. Is Edward Taylor showing too much emotion? Because some Puritans thought that he did show too much emotion. So on Saturday nights, Edward Taylor would write poetry. Now he would, I'm sure, did it other times as well, but specifically on Saturday nights, he would write poetry. That group of poetry came to be known as the preparatory meditations. That's what they're called, the preparatory meditations. And there are about 150, I think maybe even a little bit more than 150 of those actual poems that are part of the preparatory meditations. But he would write them on Saturday night because on Sunday he was preparing himself through writing the poetry, preparing himself to give his congregation the sacrament then on Sunday. So these poems are they're very private, and they are really very prayerful. In a lot of ways, what they are is kind of a prayer to God, asking for forgiveness for his sinful nature, confessing that he is a sinful person. And remember, the Puritans, especially at this point, at least until Jonathan Edwards comes along, and then they kind of start changing direction a little bit. The Puritans believe that everyone is born of sin, that everyone is a sinner. You come into the world as a sinner because of Adam and Eve. So everyone's a sinner, even young, a little tiny baby. And so these poems are very much, the ones that are the preparatory meditations, very much Edward Taylor looking inward, looking into himself, his sinful nature, and confessing to God and asking for forgiveness, and also to lead him or to help him in leading his congregation, and to make him ready, prepare him to offer the sacrament to them then on Sunday morning. He did write some other poems as well, and we're going to read a few of those also. He, in some of his poems, and we're going to read a couple of them, used a technique that is called metaphysical conceit. Metaphysical conceit. And that is a technique that some poets use, some 16th and 17th British poets would use. And so that kind of tells us that he probably did read poetry from other writers, not just Puritans. But what that means, well, first of all, a conceit is a metaphor that runs throughout the poem. Conceit is a metaphor that runs throughout the length of the poem. And we read a poem that used a conceit when we read Anne Bradstreet's The Author to Her Book, because that was just one big metaphor. The books were a metaphor, or I'm sorry, she's talking about a child, like a bratty child. That is a metaphor for her books, or her poems, I should say, her poetry. That is a conceit. Now, Edward Taylor used the metaphysical part of it, which again is something that some of the 16th and 15th and 16th, I think, British poets often used. John Donne was one of them. So the metaphysical then would be, metaphysical conceit would be a metaphor that runs the length of the poem, and it would be the metaphysical part of it would be comparing something that is earthly with something that would be divine. Right? So comparing something that's earthly with something that's divine or that's godly. And that will make a little bit more sense when we read a couple of these poems. So then I think that'll kind of come together a little bit more. A couple other things interesting about Edward Taylor. His first wife died, and they had 8 kids. They had 8 children, and she passed away. I believe she passed away giving birth to the 8th child. And I believe the child lived, but she passed. He remarried, and I believe he remarried fairly quickly, which is not unusual for Puritan men. They often, if they, well, it was, as you can imagine, not at all unusual for a woman to die during childbirth. And so oftentimes, when that happened, a Puritan man would marry, usually it was a woman much younger than they were. And in Edward Taylor's case, the second wife, I think she was about 30 years younger than he was, something like that, because he would have probably been in his, 50s or so, maybe around 60. But she was quite a bit younger than he was. They got married and he had 6 children with her. He had a total of 14 kids, 14 children. When he passed away, and they went to his home, and they found, of course, they found all these poems that he had written. I don't know that anyone realized how prolific a writer he was, because again, remember, he'd only had a few things that were published. And they found all his poetry. They also found his library, but books that he had that he'd been reading, and evidently he was practicing alchemy. Do y'all know what alchemy is? What is it, McKenna?
Indian stuff?
Huh?
Indian, I guess, making mixtures and stuff?
Yeah, you're real close. Yes, that's what it is. So it is mixing, you're right. It's taking base metals or a base metal, so it could be like copper or what else, help me out here, copper or bronze or anything that's not gold, silver, I guess, and turning it into gold. So taking a base metal and turning it into gold. Is that possible? Can you take nickel and turn it into gold? No, that is not possible. So what do you think was involved if you were an alchemist? Close, not necessarily witchcraft, but the practice of magic. So he was evidently quite involved with doing that, because he had all these books on alchemy. And I've read that he probably wasn't just doing it by himself, that probably some other men in that community, they maybe were getting together and practicing alchemy. So yes, there is certainly an element of magic, because it just can't be done, and certainly they would have known that's an impossibility, even back then. So they were probably, he was probably practicing a little bit of magic. Now, do I think that means that he wasn't a spiritual man? He's just a shyster trying to lead the people of Westfield astray? No, not at all. And in fact, when you read his poetry, you will see, especially the preparatory meditation, you will see that he very much was a devout man, a faithful man, spiritual man that evidently had a very close relationship with God. So I tell you this not to make you think he was kind of a shyster or a bad guy or anything like that, but he was a human. He might have been a Puritan minister, but even he had his flaws. And evidently, the other thing he was practicing was, and I always forget to look this up, there is a word for it, it has a name. But back in this time period, remember, people didn't know, they certainly didn't have anywhere close to the knowledge we have now of medicine. And remember, he was a town doctor. Of course, he didn't have a license, and he'd never been to medical school or even anything close. But evidently, he was also practicing ingesting human flesh. And back then, some people believed that the ingestion of human flesh would cure what ailed you. So it would help you be healthier. It'd help you to live a longer life. If you had some kind of ailment or problem, you
Is
just,
the word you're looking for cannibalism?
yeah, no. It is cannibalism, but there is another, it is that, but it was another word, and I just don't remember what it's called, but it's something. And evidently he was also practicing that because he had, I think there were some diaries or there was something, records. And again, don't think it was just him practicing this. It was probably something, well, it's probably with his alchemy buddies, some other men. I don't think it was probably any of the women. They wouldn't allow that, but I think probably some of the other men in the community. And when I say that, I don't think they were sitting around, noshing on leg bones or anything. I think what it would be was like maybe what I've read, it just would be taking just a little small, I'm not saying it makes it okay, but just a small little piece of flesh and ingesting it, thinking it would help them with their health. And and he certainly had access. I mean, he was the Undertaker, so he had access to. Huh?
Said your jokes are
Yeah, a bad joke. He had access to practice that. So anyway, but yeah, he was an interesting guy. But he did write some beautiful poetry, and yeah, interesting. Oh yeah, and also so they found all this poetry that he'd written. This is after he died. And I'm assuming it probably stayed with his much younger wife for a while, and I guess it probably got passed down to one of his 14 kids, and eventually ended up with one of his grandsons. This grandson went on to become the president of Yale University later on. And so evidently he had, I guess he probably didn't know what else to do with it, taken all this poetry that his grandfather had written and put it, I guess it was in boxes or something, in trunks, I don't know. But he stored them in the basement at Yale. And so Edward Taylor was totally forgotten. His poetry, nobody read his poetry anymore, didn't know who Edward Taylor was. And in 1939, his poetry was accidentally discovered down in the basement at Yale. And whoever discovered it started looking into Edward Taylor, and it probably wasn't too difficult to track him down since his grandson had been a president there. And they started reading his poetry, and they saw that how lovely it was, how beautiful it was, and so then his work was published. So his work, except for just a handful of poems, really was not published until 1939, so about 200 years or so. Yeah, about 200 years after he died, his poems were published. So I think that's really interesting about him. And it's kind of cool too, because there's really not a whole lot written about him just because his work wasn't published. It was probably, I guess, the first publication it was found. The poems were found in 39, so it was probably about 40, 41 when the first book of his poetry was published. But there's not a whole lot written on him. There probably is more now, but when I was in school, it was very difficult to find a whole lot. I wrote a paper on Edward Taylor, and it was actually my professor for that class, that gave me some articles about his using alchemy. And it's really interesting because if you read some of his poetry, you see where he's alluding to that. He's he talks about gold quite a bit. He talks about silver. In fact, he talks about gold several times in some of his poems, and it's obvious that he's using gold to represent God. And then he talks about silver, and it's symbolic, representing Jesus. And then he talks about bronze, and that's, the Holy Spirit. And it's really, really interesting but knowing that, some of his poetry then makes more sense. That was my professor also gave me a couple of articles about his participating in this, cannibalism. So I wish I could remember what that term is, but it is called something besides cannibalism.
You know what literature book?
I don't.
I tried looking it up.
You couldn't find anything. Well, there's no telling what kind of things you're gonna get all kinds of weird stuff now on emails and Facebook. Well, if you do Facebook. Every time I look something up, then I'm getting all this stuff, or I buy something. It's just crazy. Or my husband, he can look at something, and then I'm getting advertisements for it. It's just so crazy.
Say it.
Pretty much, you can say it or think
Literally
it.
think it.
It's
Yeah.
quite, it's kind of scary.
Yeah, I mean, exactly what I mean. Facebook and a lot of companies, they'll track your data and stuff like that.
That's exactly what they do, and then you start getting the advertisements for it.
I downloaded like something like, I guess it was like a game or something, and it literally like, was like, can we like go into other apps to make ads better or whatever? I was like,
It's crazy.
I don't know.
Crazy. All right, I'm gonna give you all the packet of some of his poems. And I think I have three that are actually part of the preparatory meditation. And they're not named. They usually, like Emily Dixon did the same thing. They gave names to his poems, but they just have them by either the first line or they actually gave them a number. And it wouldn't have been him, it would have been whoever later on, I guess. I kind of copied it deeply the first time and left off. I accidentally had just the first page or the last page of one poem. And then didn't copy the first and I left it off or something, so I'm gonna include that one too. Yeah, first off, Edward Taylor was interesting. And then Bradstreet seemed kind of boring now, didn't he? Simon might have been one of them that was practicing alchemy. No, not really. Let me give you. Another poem. Come back. Robert Christmas, this is not one of the preparatory meditations. This is one that is a metaphysical conceit. So I think I started saying this, and then I was about to try to find it. Your writing prompts tomorrow will be over Ann Bradstreet. Because we didn't get through, we didn't even get to any of Edward Taylor's poetry and things. Go ahead and bring your poems with you too. Let's look at, we'll just kind of read together one of these and then I'll let y'all, tomorrow's Friday. Make sure, just go ahead and bring these back on Monday. No, we won't be here Monday, on Tuesday. And we'll go over and analyze these other poems. But let's look at this one. It's Meditation 26. It's like on the second or third page. That's what you have, I think. Well, yours might look different. The Meditation 26, it's a short one. So So remember, he wrote these meditations, preparatory meditations, preparing himself to give the sacrament the next day. So really, these are pretty much just kind of a prayer to God, but he's also looking inward and confessing his sinful nature. So I'm just going to read this. Unclean, unclean, my Lord, undone, all vile, yea, all is defiled. What shall thy servant do? Unfit for thee, not fit for holy soil, nor for communion of saints below. A bag of botches, lump of loathsomeness, defiled by touch, by issue, leprous flesh. Thou wilt have all that enter do not hold, pure, clean, and bright, whiter than white as snow, better refined than most refined gold. There's an allusion to gold right there, alchemist. I am not so, but foul. What shall I do? Shall thy church doors be shut and shut out me? He's kind of hard on himself. Vile, vile, unfit, defiled by touch, leprous flesh. I guess he'd know all about that. Unclean. I am not so. I'm foul. But this is his, and they're not all this bad. I mean, as far as being just really, wow. But some of them are. I mean, some of his preparatory meditations, some are really beautiful. And they're very spiritual. But some of them, and this is an example of that, are just really, they're kind of gross. In a way, they really are. And it's not that I don't think he was trying to be gross at all, but I think this is how he really felt, that he was unfit to be giving the sacrament the next day. But then he asked the question, what shall I do? I mean, everyone's a sinner. We've all sinned. So, what shall I do? And so he's asking, shall thy church doors be shut and shut out me? So he's asking for forgiveness, and he is recognizing that he's a sinner. He went a really bad one. Defile and vile and unclean, a bag of botches. So, but this was really like a prayer to God. And not one of his more beautiful ones, but it does continue. Let me read the rest. I'm sorry. Do y'all have the rest of it? Okay, I must have left this part off. I'll just read this to you. That's okay. Shall not church fellowship my portion be? How can it be? Thy churches do require pure holiness. I am filth, alas. Shall I defile them, tumbled thus in mine? Are they me cleansed before I current pass? If thus they do, where is the mitre bright? And so they offer me to wash me white. The brisk red heifers, I guess it's heifers, ashes when calcined, mixed all in running water, is too weak to wash away my filth. The doves assigned, burnt, and sin offerings near do the feet. But as they emblemize, the fountain spring thy blood, my Lord, set off to wash off sin. So he's, been referring to blood of Jesus can wash away even his sin, his filthy sin. But even reading this, there's allusions even in this to, alchemy and that sort of thing. And some of them even more than this. I wrote a paper on him, and I don't remember now, it's been so long ago, which meditation, but I found some that really, really went into how, gold represented God, and it's talking about, the beauty of gold and the power of gold, and it just kind of goes on and on. So it's obviously, to some extent, I think he was very much referring to his practicing of alchemy, even though he certainly was doing it he wasn't doing it with everyone knowing. He wasn't, talking about it. He kept it to himself, except for maybe a few other people that might have been practicing it with him. But anyway, all right, we'll just leave it there at that. And bring this back, we'll finish up on him on Tuesday. And tomorrow, I'll take no, E. Bradstreet.